The demon knocking. A family's grim curse. Summary. In the heart of Flock Hung Village, the Hargrove family is haunted by an ancient curse known as the Knock of the Accursed. When Emily Hargrove's father dies during a violent storm, a mysterious knocking begins, signaling the curse's deadly intentions. As the family gathers to grieve, long-buried secrets of betrayal, greed, and a feud with a long-lost sibling resurface. Emily discovers her family's sinister past through her father's journal, revealing the curse's origins and a fractured inheritance. Determined to end the horror, Emily tracks down her estranged uncle Philip, who has been living in isolation, tormented by guilt. The curse's relentless knock grows louder as it demands its due. During the wake, the entity manifests, targeting Philip as the source of the family's suffering. In a heart-wrenching moment, Philip sacrifices himself to save his family, seemingly appeasing the curse. But as the storm fades and the family begins to heal, a faint knock echoes through the house, leaving them questioning if the nightmare is truly over. Combining elements of suspense, tragedy, and supernatural terror, the story explores the haunting weight of family sins and the lengths one will go to for redemption. Part 1. The Stormy Night. The storm roared with relentless fury. A cacophony of wind and rain that seemed determined to drown the village of Flock Hung. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the Hargrove household in fleeting, ghostly flashes. Inside, the oppressive weight of grief filled the dimly lit bedroom, where Emily Hargrove sat clutching her father's frail hand. His shallow breaths grew weaker, each one a fragile thread tethering him to life. "It's time," Margaret whispered from the corner, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and resignation. The elderly woman clutched her rosary tightly, her lips moving in silent prayer. Emily glanced at her aunt but said nothing, focusing instead on her father's pale face. With a final, ragged breath, Robert Hargrove's chest fell still. The room descended into an eerie silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Emily's heart ached as tears streamed down her cheeks. Her younger brother James stood frozen near the doorway, his face pale and expressionless. Margaret crossed herself, muttering, "May the Lord have mercy on his soul." Then, her gaze shifted to the rattling window. The storm. It's a sign. Death never comes alone in this family. Emily's head snapped up, her grief momentarily overshadowed by irritation. "Not now, Aunt Margaret." Please. Margaret ignored her, her eyes filled with a distant fear. "You don't understand. This family has a history, Emily. The curse doesn't end with death." Emily exhaled sharply, standing up and wiping her tears. "This isn't the time for superstition. We need to focus on the arrangements." James finally found his voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. "What does she mean? What curse?" Margaret hesitated, her knuckles white around the rosary. "You'll see soon enough," she murmured cryptically. The storm outside howled louder, as if in response. Emily shook her head, dismissing her aunt's words as the ramblings of an old woman. Yet deep down, a sliver of unease began to take root. The minutes passed in oppressive quiet, broken only by the relentless storm. Emily moved mechanically, closing her father's eyes and smoothing his bedsheets. James hovered near the doorway, his hands gripping the frame as though it could anchor him. We need to call someone," he stammered. Emily nodded, her voice low. "I'll make the calls in the morning. For now, let's sit with him." Margaret, still clutching her rosary, stood and approached the bed. Her steps were deliberate, heavy with unspoken fear. She placed a trembling hand on Robert's forehead and whispered another prayer. Emily tried to focus on practicalities, but Margaret's earlier words clung to her like a shadow. The idea of a curse felt absurd, yet the storm seemed almost sentient, its ferocity too perfectly timed to dismiss. As they sat in the room, the wind screeched through cracks in the windows, its wail eerily human. James shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the door every time a gust caused it to creak. "It's just the storm," Emily said, more to herself than anyone else. Margaret didn't respond. Her eyes remained fixed on Robert's face, her lips moving silently. The room felt colder, though no window was open. Emily shivered, pulling her cardigan tighter around herself. Then came the knock. It was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the howling storm with unnatural clarity. The sound reverberated through the house, silencing even the wind for a moment. Emily froze, her pulse quickening. "What was that?" James whispered, his voice tight with fear. Margaret's knuckles whitened as she clutched the rosary harder. "It's begun," she murmured. Emily shot her a look. "It's probably a neighbor," she said, though her voice betrayed her unease. She stood, forcing her legs to move. Each step toward the door felt heavier, the sound of the storm receding to a low hum in her ears. "Emily, don't," Margaret hissed. "Do not open that door." Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "What if someone needs help?" "It's not someone," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "It's something." Another knock, louder this time, made Emily jump. Her heart pounded as she steeled herself and turned the knob. She pulled the door open, the wind howling past her, rain spraying into the entryway. There was no one there. Lightning illuminated the yard, casting long, eerie shadows. The trees swayed violently, their branches clawing at the air. Emily stared out into the storm, her chest tightening with unease. She closed the door slowly, turning back to the others. Margaret's expression was grim, her eyes hollow. "It's the knock of the accursed," she whispered. James's face went pale. Margaret looked at them both, her voice heavy with dread. "Every time someone in this family dies, the knock comes. It's a warning. A promise. The curse always takes another." Emily's patience snapped. "Enough with the curse nonsense. There's no such thing. This is just a storm, Margaret." Margaret's eyes burned with intensity. "You'll see," she said softly. "Before this storm ends, you'll see." Part 2. The first knock. The wind howled through the village of Flock Hung, carrying with it a cacophony of rattling shutters and the mournful creaks of weather-beaten homes. Yet, inside the Hargrove household, a deeper, more insidious sound cut through the storm. A knock. Sharp and deliberate, it reverberated through the house like the toll of a bell. Margaret's head snapped up, her face ashen. Clutching her rosary tightly, she whispered, "It's begun." Emily, still reeling from her father's death, turned sharply toward the sound. "What do you mean?" she demanded, her voice tinged with irritation and a growing unease. "It's probably a neighbor needing help in this storm," but Margaret's gaze remained fixed on the door, her lips moving in silent prayer. "It's the knock of the accursed," she finally murmured, her voice barely audible over the storm. James, seated stiffly on the sofa, blinked at her. Margaret's knuckles whitened as she tightened her grip on the rosary. "Every time someone in this family dies, the knock comes," she said. "It's a warning. A promise. The curse always takes another." Emily shook her head, exhaling sharply. "Enough, Margaret. This isn't the time for superstitions." But before she could continue, the knock came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. Emily's heart pounded as she stepped toward the door. Each footfall seemed to echo unnaturally, the air thick with tension. "Emily, don't," Margaret pleaded. Her voice wavered with fear. "You don't know what you're inviting." And ignoring her, Emily reached for the doorknob. Her hand hesitated over the cold metal, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. What if Margaret was right? Shaking off the thought, she pulled the door open. The storm surged past her, rain soaking the threshold. Lightning illuminated the yard in stark flashes, revealing nothing but swaying trees and a flooded path. There was no one there. Emily exhaled, a mixture of relief and frustration. She turned back to Margaret, closing the door firmly behind her. "See? It's just the storm." Margaret's face remained grim. "The knock doesn't lie," she said. "It's only the beginning." The tension in the house grew as the hours dragged on. Emily busied herself with small tasks, trying to push aside the unsettling events. James paced the living room, his unease palpable. Margaret sat in the corner, her eyes fixed on the window, her rosary clutched so tightly her knuckles had turned white. By midnight, the storm had worsened. The wind screamed like a living thing, and the house groaned under its assault. Then, without warning, the knock came again. This time it was deafening, reverberating through the walls as if demanding entry. James jumped, his face pale. "Emily, don't," he urged as she moved toward the door once more. "Let it go." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Do not open that door," she commanded, her voice steely. "It's not someone out there. It's something. And it's here for us." Emily froze, torn between her instincts and Margaret's ominous warnings. Her hand hovered over the doorknob as she turned to face her aunt. "What are you saying? What does it want?" Margaret's expression darkened. The curse was born from blood, greed, betrayal. Every generation pays the price. The knock, it's the harbinger. It won't stop until it's claimed another soul. Emily's frustration boiled over. "That's ridiculous. Curses aren't real. It's just a storm." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her voice. The knock had sounded too deliberate, too calculated, and Margaret's terror was infectious. "You don't have to believe me," Margaret said, her tone icy. "But if you open that door again, you'll believe soon enough." The hours dragged on, each one more oppressive than the last. The knock came at irregular intervals, sometimes loud and commanding, other times faint and teasing. Each sound chipped away at their nerves, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. James eventually sat on the edge of the sofa, his head in his hands. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice muffled. Margaret didn't answer immediately. She stared into the distance, her expression vacant. Finally, she said, "We wait. It always chooses. There's nothing we can do to stop it." Emily shook her head, her resolve hardening. "I refuse to accept that. This is just fear playing tricks on us." Margaret's gaze snapped to Emily, her eyes blazing. "Fear doesn't knock like that. Fear doesn't take. The curse is real, Emily. You can't outrun it." Lightning illuminated the room, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Emily's chest tightened as she looked around, suddenly feeling the weight of unseen eyes. For the first time, she wondered if Margaret was right. The knock came again, louder than ever, its sound vibrating through the walls and shaking the very floor beneath them. James jumped up, his face pale and glistening with sweat. "We have to do something," he exclaimed. Margaret closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. "There's nothing to do but wait. The curse must take its due." Emily gritted her teeth, her frustration mounting alongside her fear. "You keep saying that, but you're not giving us answers. What exactly is this curse? Why us?" Margaret opened her eyes, her gaze heavy with sorrow. "Your great-grandfather wronged someone deeply, Emily. Betrayal and greed stained this family's name. And this is our penance." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Emily stared at her aunt, trying to make sense of the revelations. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a tortured soul. Another knock came, followed by a chilling silence. For the first time that night, the house seemed to hold its breath. Margaret's face was pale, her lips trembling as she whispered, "It's here." Part 3. Secrets Unearthed. The storm's relentless fury wrapped the Hargrove household in a blanket of unease. Rain slammed against the windows, the wind's mournful howl creeping through the cracks, and the low rumble of thunder seemed to resonate with the family's turmoil. Seeking solace, Emily retreated to her father's study, the one place she thought might offer clarity amidst the chaos. The small room smelled faintly of leather and ink, a place untouched by the modern world. She ran her fingers along the shelves, brushing away years of dust as her eyes scanned titles she'd seen countless times but never read. Then, tucked behind a row of encyclopedias, she saw a leather-bound journal, worn with time. Her heart raced as she reached for it, the simple act weighted with a strange anticipation. Emily sat at the desk, the dim lamplight casting long shadows that danced with each flicker of lightning. She opened the journal, her father's neat handwriting bringing a pang of sorrow. The first few pages were mundane, filled with daily musings and reflections on books he'd read. But soon, the entries grew darker, tinged with worry. June 15th. I can't shake the feeling that the sins of the past are catching up with us. Philip's betrayal still lingers like a shadow over this family. The inheritance he stole was more than just money. It was trust, love, the very bond that held us together. Margaret believes the curse is real. Sometimes, I think she might be right. Emily's brow furrowed. Philip. She hadn't heard that name in years. Her father rarely spoke of his estranged brother, and when he did, it was with bitterness. She'd been too young to grasp the details, but the feud had torn the family apart. As she read on, a chill crept up her spine. November 3rd. The storm last night was unlike any I've seen before. Margaret's talk of the knock resurfaced. She's convinced it's a harbinger, that the curse takes another with every death. I've always dismissed it as superstition, but the knocking. I heard it too. Her pulse quickened. Her father had written about the knock. She turned the pages faster, the entries unraveling into a tapestry of fear and guilt. He described sleepless nights, whispers in the shadows, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. Then came the final entry, scrawled hastily. January 27th. If you're reading this, Emily, know that I'm sorry. I tried to protect you and James from this burden, but it seems the past cannot be buried. Philip must return. He's the key to ending this. The journal slipped from her trembling hands. The room seemed colder, the shadows deeper. Her father's words echoed in her mind, each syllable cementing the reality of Margaret's warnings. If Philip was the key, she had to find him. Emily clutched the journal tightly as she entered the living room. The air was thick with tension. Margaret's head snapped up, her sharp eyes locking onto the book. You found it, Margaret said, her voice heavy with resignation. Why didn't you tell me? Emily demanded, anger lacing her words. About Philip? About the curse? Margaret's shoulders sagged. What would it have changed? The curse is woven into the fabric of this family. Philip's greed, his betrayal. It set everything in motion. James, who had been sitting silently, looked up. Who is Philip? Margaret's lips thinned. Your father's brother. My youngest sibling. He stole what wasn't his. The inheritance your grandfather left for all of us. It wasn't just money, James. It was meant to bind us together, to keep the family whole. But Philip, he took it all and disappeared. Emily held up the journal. Dad thought Philip was the key to ending this. Why? Margaret's expression darkened. Because Philip's betrayal cursed this family. His actions marked us, and the curse won't rest until he answers for what he did. James stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. So what are we supposed to do? Find him. Drag him back here. Margaret's eyes glistened with unshed tears. If he's even still alive, the storm's unrelenting assault matched the turmoil in Emily's mind. She sat by the window, the journal open on her lap. Her father's words played over and over in her head, a haunting melody she couldn't escape. The knock came again, softer this time, as if testing her resolve. She flinched but didn't move. We have to find him, she said finally, breaking the silence. James, slumped in a chair across the room, stared at her incredulously. In this storm? Where would we even start? Margaret spoke from her corner, her voice steady but somber. Philip used to live near the old mill. If he's anywhere, it'll be there. Emily stood, determination stealing her nerves. Then that's where we'll start. James groaned but stood as well, brushing off his fatigue. Margaret remained seated, clutching her rosary as she whispered, Be careful. If the curse is already awakened, it won't let you go so easily. Part 4. Philip's exile. The rain poured down like a relentless torrent as Emily and James trudged through the muddy path leading to the old mill on the outskirts of Hung village. The storm showed no signs of relenting, its ferocious winds howling through the trees, bending them as though in pain. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of their task pressing on their shoulders. Are we even sure he's still here? James asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. He squinted through the rain, his face pale with apprehension. Emily held up the flashlight, its weak beam struggling to pierce the darkness. If he's alive, Margaret said, this is where he'd be. Her voice carried a conviction she didn't entirely feel. As they approached the mill, its silhouette loomed against the backdrop of the storm, a crumbling structure swallowed by years of neglect. Vines crawled up its walls, and shattered windows stared back like empty eyes. Emily shivered, not entirely from the cold. This place gives me the creeps, James muttered, stepping closer to his sister. Emily's grip on the flashlight tightened. Let's just find him and get out of here. They reached the door. Its wood warped and swollen from years of exposure to the elements. Emily knocked once, then again, harder. The sound echoed, swallowed by the storm. No one's here, James said, a note of relief in his voice. He turned to leave, but Emily grabbed his arm. Wait. Give it a minute. Moments later, faint shuffling came from within. Emily's heart leapt to her throat as the door creaked open, revealing a gaunt figure. Philip Hargrove stood before them, his face hollow and pale, his eyes sunken and shadowed by sleepless nights. A tangle of gray hair fell to his shoulders, and his clothes hung from his frame like they belonged to someone else. Emily, he rasped, his voice cracked from disuse. His gaze shifted to James. And you must be James. Emily nodded, her initial resolve faltering at the sight of him. Uncle Philip, she began, but he held up a hand. Don't, he said, stepping back to let them inside. You shouldn't have come here. The interior of the mill was no less foreboding than its exterior. Dust coated every surface and the air smelled of mildew and decay. A single lantern flickered on a table in the corner, casting weak light across the room. The wind whistled through gaps in the walls, creating a low, mournful moan. Philip gestured for them to sit. Emily hesitated, but James sank onto a rickety chair, the exhaustion evident on his face. You shouldn't have come, Philip repeated, his voice heavier this time. He sat across from them, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. The glow from the ember illuminated the deep creases in his face. The curse. It doesn't rest. It won't stop until it's taken what it's owed. Emily leaned forward, her frustration bubbling to the surface. That's why we're here. Dad said you're the key to ending this. You have to help us. Philip's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. Your father always was a fool, he said, taking a drag from his cigarette. He thought there was a way out. There isn't. James's fist clenched. So what, you're just going to sit here and wait for it to come for you? Philip's eyes met his nephew's, and for a moment, James saw something there, fear, regret, or perhaps resignation. You don't understand, Philip said. I've been running from this for decades, and it always catches up. Emily's voice softened. What happened, Uncle Philip? Why did you leave? What did you do? Philip's hands shook as he stubbed out the cigarette. He looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant memory. I took what wasn't mine. The inheritance. It was supposed to be split between us, but I couldn't share it. I thought I deserved it more. So I took it, and I left. And that cursed us? James asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. Philip's head snapped back toward them, his eyes wild. It wasn't just money, he shouted, the outburst startling them both. That inheritance. It was tied to something older, something darker. Our grandfather made a deal, and when I broke it, I broke us all. The room fell silent. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, its wail seeping through the walls. Shadows flickered unnaturally across the room, their shapes elongating and twisting in ways that defied logic. Emily's throat tightened. So how do we stop it? Philip shook his head. You don't. The curse doesn't stop. It takes what it's owed, and then it waits. You can't fight it. You can only delay it. James stood abruptly, knocking over the chair. That's it? You're just going to sit here and do nothing? While it takes another. Philip's expression hardened. I've done my penance, he said. It's not my turn anymore. Emily grabbed James's arm, stopping him from saying more. She turned to Philip, her voice steady but cold. You're coming back with us. Philip laughed again, a bitter sound. And what, face it together? No. It'll find me soon enough. But if you want to die trying, be my guest. As they left the mill, the storm's intensity seemed to wane, but the air felt heavier. Emily couldn't shake Philip's words from her mind. They had found him, but they were no closer to ending the curse. If anything, the visit had only deepened the mystery. James walked in silence beside her, his shoulders hunched. Finally he spoke. What now? Emily glanced back at the mill, its shadow disappearing into the night. Now, we figure out the truth. No matter what it takes. As they walked away, a distant sound followed them, a faint, rhythmic knocking, almost lost in the howl of the wind. James froze, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Emily nodded, her grip tightening on the flashlight. Neither of them spoke as they quickened their pace, the ominous sound fading but not forgotten. Part 5. The curse strengthens. The Hargrove household was deathly quiet as Emily and James returned from their harrowing visit to the mill. The storm outside seemed to abate slightly, but its relentless wind still whistled eerily through the cracks of the old house. Margaret greeted them at the door, her face pale, her eyes wide with the anxiety she had been unable to shake since their departure. "What did he say?" Margaret demanded, clutching her rosary tightly. "Did Philip agree to help?" Emily shook her head, her face unreadable. "He's not coming. He doesn't think there's anything to be done." Margaret's face crumpled, but before she could respond, a sudden, sharp knock echoed through the house. It was loud, deliberate, and unmistakable. Everyone froze. James's breath hitched, his eyes darting to the front door. "It's just the wind," Emily said quickly, though her voice betrayed her unease. She turned to Margaret, her resolve faltering. Right, Margaret's lips moved in silent prayer, her knuckles white around the rosary. "It's the curse," she whispered. "It's growing stronger." The knocking persisted, its rhythm irregular yet deliberate, as though mocking their attempts to ignore it. Emily's chest tightened with every strike. She marched to the door, throwing it open, the cold night air rushing in. Nothing. No one was there. Lightning illuminated the empty yard, revealing nothing but rain-soaked earth. Emily shut the door, turning back to James and Margaret. "It's just the storm," she insisted, though her hands shook. But as the hours dragged on, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, shadows danced unnaturally in the dim light, and faint whispers seemed to drift through the halls. James, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere, paced the living room, his nerves stretched to the breaking point. "This isn't normal," he muttered, glancing nervously at the darkened windows. "Emily, we have to do something. We can't just sit here and let whatever this is take us." Emily clenched her jaw, her mind racing. She thought of her father's journal, the cryptic warnings he had left behind. "We need to figure out what it wants," she said finally. "If the curse is real, there has to be a way to stop it." Margaret shook her head. "You don't stop the curse. You survive it." As the night deepened, the activity in the house intensified. Doors slammed shut on their own, lights flickered, and objects moved without cause. James's frustration boiled over as he slammed his fist on the table. "We're sitting ducks. This thing is toying with us." Margaret's voice was low, almost a growl. "It's testing us. It wants us to break." Emily paced the room, her thoughts a whirlwind. Every strange occurrence seemed to tug at her memories, fragments of stories her father had told her as a child. The family's history was littered with mysterious deaths, accidents, and disappearances. Could it all be connected? Suddenly the knocking returned, louder and more insistent than before. It echoed through the house like a drumbeat, relentless and deafening. James covered his ears, shouting, "Make it stop." Emily moved toward the door, but Margaret grabbed her arm. "Don't," she hissed. "Opening the door won't end it. It'll let it in." Emily froze, her pulse racing. The knocking ceased abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Margaret's grip loosened, but her expression remained grim. The silence did not bring relief. Instead, a new phenomenon began. Faint footsteps echoed upstairs, slow and deliberate. James's face drained of color as he whispered, "No one's up there." Emily grabbed a flashlight, her jaw set. "Stay here," she instructed, her voice firm despite the terror clawing at her chest. "You're not going up there alone," James protested, but Emily had already started up the creaking staircase. Each step felt heavier than the last as she ascended. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. She reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the hallway. The door to her father's room was ajar, a faint light spilling into the corridor. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The light flickered, and the door creaked open wider. Emily stepped inside, her heart pounding. The room was empty, but the journal lay open on the desk, its pages fluttering as though caught in an unseen breeze. She approached cautiously, her fingers brushing the worn pages. A single phrase was scrawled across the open page in her father's handwriting. It wants the truth. Emily returned downstairs, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. It's not just here to torment us, she said, her voice trembling. It wants something. The truth about what happened. Margaret's face darkened. The truth won't save us, she said. The truth will destroy us. James stood, his fists clenched. Then we have no choice. We find the truth, or this thing tears us apart. The knocking resumed, softer this time, almost inviting. Emily opened the journal, her father's words guiding her through the chaos. Somewhere within those pages lay the key to ending the curse. But as the night wore on, the house seemed to close in around them, its very walls whispering secrets they were not yet ready to hear. Part 6. Confronting the Entity. The day of Robert Hargrove's wake arrived under a sky choked with dark clouds. The storm that had haunted the family for days lingered, its presence an oppressive reminder of the curse that shadowed their lives. Relatives and close friends filed into the house, their hushed whispers and sympathetic glances doing little to ease the tension. The air inside was heavy, thick with both grief and fear. Emily moved through the crowd mechanically, her thoughts a whirlwind of unease. James stood near the door, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously every time a shadow shifted or a door creaked. Margaret sat by the window, her rosary clutched tightly in her hands as she muttered prayers under her breath. The knocking began softly, almost imperceptibly, blending with the murmurs of the gathered mourners. Emily's heart sank as she heard it, the now familiar rhythm crawling up her spine. She glanced at Margaret, whose face had gone ashen. Their eyes met, and no words were needed. The curse was escalating. As the night deepened, the atmosphere grew oppressive. The guests lingered in the living room, their conversations uneasy. Then, as if summoned by the weight of their collective dread, the knock came again. This time it was thunderous, reverberating through the house and silencing the room. Everyone froze. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared approach the door. Emily, her hands trembling, stood. "I'll check," she said, though her voice betrayed her fear. "Don't," Margaret hissed, her voice sharp. "It's not here for them. It's here for us." Before Emily could respond, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Gasps erupted from the guests, and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the silence. "Stay calm," Emily said, though her own voice wavered. She grabbed a flashlight and swept its beam across the room. The faces of the mourners were pale, their eyes wide with fear. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. It seemed to echo from every direction, as though the house itself was alive with its sound. Emily's chest tightened as she turned toward the source. The door to the study, her father's sanctuary, stood ajar, a faint, flickering light spilling into the hallway. "It's in there," James whispered, his voice barely audible. Emily nodded, swallowing hard. She stepped toward the study, each footfall echoing in the unnatural silence. James and Margaret followed, their fear palpable. The door creaked open wider as Emily approached, revealing the shadowed interior. Inside the study, the air was icy, the flickering light emanating from a single candle on the desk. The journal lay open, its pages fluttering despite the absence of wind. And then from the corner of the room, a figure emerged. It was a shadow at first, an amorphous mass that seemed to drink in the light. But as it moved, it took form, a tall, gaunt figure cloaked in darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin orbs of malevolent fire that bore into Emily's soul. The entity radiated a palpable malice, its presence suffocating. Margaret gasped, clutching her rosary so tightly her knuckles turned white. James took a step back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Philip," the entity hissed, its voice a guttural rasp that seemed to reverberate through the room. "The debt remains unpaid." Emily's heart raced as she realized the figure wasn't addressing her. It was looking past her, its fiery gaze fixed on the doorway. She turned, and there stood Philip, his face a mask of resignation. He had come, despite his earlier refusal. "You finally come for me," Philip said, his voice trembling but steady. He stepped into the room, his shadow stretching unnaturally behind him. "I knew this day would come." The entity's form shifted, its edges writhing like smoke. "You cannot escape the past," it said. "You broke the bond. You invited the curse." Philip nodded, his expression heavy with guilt. "I did. And I've paid for it every day since. But if you must take me to end this, then so be it." "No," Emily cried, stepping between Philip and the entity. "This isn't just his fault. The greed, the betrayal. It was all of us. If you want retribution, take it from me too." The entity paused, its flickering form growing still. The room seemed to hold its breath. "The blood is tied," it said finally. "The curse binds all." But the choice is made before anyone could react. The entity surged forward, enveloping Philip in a shroud of darkness. He gasped, his body convulsing as the shadow consumed him. Emily screamed, reaching for him, but Margaret pulled her back. "It's too late," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. The entity receded, taking Philip with it. As the shadows dissolved, the candle flickered out, plunging the room into darkness once more. When the lights returned, Philip was gone. The journal lay closed on the desk, its cover unmarred. The mourners fled the house soon after, their whispers filled with fear and confusion. Emily, James, and Margaret sat in the living room, the weight of what had transpired settling over them. "Is it over?" James asked, his voice trembling. Margaret shook her head. "The curse doesn't end. It waits." Emily clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. "Then we find a way to break it, once and for all." Part 7. A sacrificial choice. The house remained cloaked in a heavy silence after Philip's disappearance, but it was not the calm of peace, it was the dread-filled quiet that follows the eye of a storm. Emily, James, and Margaret sat in the dim living room, each absorbed by their own turmoil. Yet even as their fear and grief threatened to consume them, a deep, resonant knock shattered the stillness once again. The curse was not finished. Emily rose abruptly, her movements stiff with anger and despair. "It's not enough," she muttered, pacing the room. "Philip's gone. And it's still not enough." Margaret, her rosary dangling from limp fingers, whispered. "The curse takes what it wants. We don't control it." "No," James interjected, standing. His face, pale and gaunt, was lit with a fire Emily hadn't seen before. "Philip's gone because he chose to be taken. He offered himself, and it accepted. That has to mean something." Margaret nodded reluctantly. "He was trying to protect us, to give the curse what it was owed." The knock came again, louder this time, as if answering their speculation. Emily flinched, but her jaw set in determination. "Then that's what we have to do. We make a choice." The three of them returned to the study, their footsteps echoing through the hall like a funeral march. The room felt colder than before, its shadows darker and more oppressive. The journal sat on the desk, closed, yet Emily felt as though its contents were calling to her. James hesitated at the doorway, his fists clenched. "How do we even know this will work? What if it takes all of us?" Emily turned to him, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "If we do nothing, it will take us one by one. At least this way we have a chance." Margaret stepped forward, her rosary clutched tightly. "It will take the one who offers themselves." That's what Philip understood. But it must be voluntary. The curse demands a willing sacrifice. Emily's stomach churned as she met Margaret's gaze. "Then I'll do it." "No," James said sharply, stepping in front of her. "I'm not letting you do this." Emily's voice cracked as she replied. "It's my choice, James. If I can end this, for you, for everyone, then it's worth it." Margaret's trembling voice broke through their argument. "It doesn't matter who chooses. The curse will take the one who means the most to this family." That's why it took Philip. The weight of her words sank in, leaving the room in a stunned silence. The knocking resumed, insistent and rhythmic, as if urging them to decide. Emily stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "If it wants me, it can have me," she said, her voice resolute. "But I'll do this on my terms." She opened the journal, flipping through its pages until she reached the passage her father had written. The curse binds us to the truth. The blood debt cannot be erased, but it can be paid. The candle on the desk flickered, its flame twisting unnaturally. The shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming into the now familiar figure of the entity. Its glowing eyes fixed on Emily, its presence filling the room with a suffocating dread. The debt remains. The entity intoned, its voice like the grinding of ancient stones. Who will pay? Emily stepped forward, her hands trembling but her gaze steady. I will. The entity paused, its form flickering. For a moment, Emily thought she saw something human in its eyes, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even understanding. Then it moved, shifting toward her with an unnatural grace. But before it could reach her, James stepped in front of her. No, he said, his voice firm. Take me instead. Emily tried to push him aside, but he held his ground. This family needs you, Emily. You can find a way to make things right. But you can't do that if you're gone. The entity seemed to consider James, its form stilling. You offer yourself willingly, it asked. James nodded, his voice unwavering. Yes, take me and leave the rest of them alone. The room grew colder, the candlelight dimming further. The entity surged forward, enveloping James in its shadowy embrace. He gasped, his body stiffening as the darkness consumed him. James, Emily screamed, reaching for him. But Margaret held her back, her own face streaked with tears. It's done, Margaret whispered. He saved us. As suddenly as it had appeared, the entity receded, taking James with it. The candle's flame flared brightly before extinguishing completely, leaving the room in darkness. When the lights flickered back on, James was gone. The journal lay closed on the desk, its surface unmarred. Emily fell to her knees, her tears flowing freely. Margaret knelt beside her, placing a trembling hand on her shoulder. He did what he thought was right, Margaret said softly. He gave us a chance to end this. Emily's grief turned to resolve as she rose, clutching the journal. Then we'll finish it, she said, her voice steady. No more sacrifices, no more waiting. We'll find a way to break this curse, once and for all. Part 8. The Aftermath. Dawn broke with a hesitant light, the gray sky seeming to reflect the fractured emotions within the Hargrove household. The storm that had raged for days had finally subsided, leaving behind a thick mist that clung to the ground like a lingering memory of the horrors the family had endured. Inside the house, the air was heavy with an almost unbearable stillness. Emily sat at the kitchen table, the journal open before her. Though she hadn't turned a page in hours, her hands rested on the worn leather cover, her mind replaying the events of the previous night. James was gone, and the weight of his sacrifice pressed down on her like a physical force. Across from her, Margaret stared into her cup of tea, the rosary that had never left her grip now lying limp on the table. He saved us, Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. James saved us all. Emily's jaw tightened, her grief mingling with anger. He shouldn't have had to. Her fingers clenched around the journal. This curse. It's taken too much from us already. Dad, Philip, and now James. It ends here. Margaret glanced at her niece, her eyes filled with sorrow and doubt. And how do you plan to stop it, Emily? It's older than any of us. Older than this house. It's in our blood. Emily's voice hardened. Then we cut it out. The house felt emptier than ever. The echoes of James's laughter, Philip's reluctant wisdom, and even her father's steady presence seemed to linger just beyond reach, like ghosts haunting the periphery of her mind. Emily couldn't stop moving, pacing from room to room as if searching for answers hidden in the walls. She stopped in her father's study, her eyes drawn to the desk where the journal lay. The desk had always been a place of quiet contemplation for him, a space where he had worked to make sense of their family's twisted history. Emily sat down, running her fingers over the grain of the wood, and opened the journal once more. The pages seemed different now, the words carrying a weight she hadn't fully understood before. Her father had spent years piecing together the origins of the curse, tracing it back to their grandfather and the fateful betrayal that had set everything in motion. But there were gaps, questions left unanswered, truths buried too deep for him to uncover. Margaret entered the room, her movements slow and deliberate. You won't find peace in those pages, Emily, she said gently. Your father tried, and look where it brought him. Emily shook her head. It's not peace I'm looking for. It's answers. If this curse is tied to our blood, then there has to be a way to break it. Margaret sighed, sinking into the chair across from her. You're so much like your father. Always looking for a way to fix things. But some things just have to be endured. Emily's eyes blazed. No, I refuse to accept that. If James was willing to give his life to save us, then I owe it to him to find a way to end this. For good. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Emily and Margaret worked in silence to clean the house, the mundane tasks providing a fragile sense of normalcy. The guests had left hours earlier, their whispered condolences feeling hollow in the wake of such a profound loss. As Emily scrubbed the floorboards in the study, she uncovered a loose plank near the desk. Curiosity piqued, she pried it open to reveal a small metal box, tarnished with age. Inside was a collection of letters, brittle and yellowed, addressed to her grandfather. Margaret entered the room as Emily read through the first letter, her face pale. What is it? Margaret asked, her voice hushed. Emily looked up, her expression grim. It's a contract. Grandfather made a deal. With something. And he used our bloodline as collateral. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Dear God, the letters detailed an agreement between their grandfather and a mysterious figure, promising prosperity and protection for the family in exchange for an unspoken debt. The final letter hinted at betrayal, a broken promise that had unleashed a curse upon their lineage. Emily's hands shook as she held the letters. This is it. This is the beginning. If we can undo what he did, maybe we can end this. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You don't know what you're dealing with, Emily. This isn't something you can just undo. Emily's jaw set. We have to try. That evening, as the mist began to lift, Emily and Margaret sat together in the living room, the letters spread out before them. They pored over every word, searching for a clue, a loophole, anything that could break the chain of suffering. There, Emily said, pointing to a line in the final letter. It says the debt can be transferred. If the original promise is fulfilled, the curse can be lifted. Margaret frowned. But the original promise was broken. How can we fulfill it now? Emily's eyes narrowed. We find whoever. Or whatever. This deal was made with. And we finish what our grandfather started. Margaret's face darkened. You're talking about summoning the very thing that cursed us. Emily met her gaze. If that's what it takes to end this, then yes. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, the house felt different. The shadows seemed less oppressive, the air less stifling. But the emptiness left by James's absence was a constant reminder of what they had lost. Emily stood at the window, staring out into the darkness. She clutched the journal and letters to her chest, her resolve hardening with every passing moment. Margaret approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're determined to do this, aren't you? Margaret asked softly. Emily nodded. For James. For Dad. For all of us. Margaret sighed, her expression a mixture of fear and admiration. Then we'll face it together. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. As the mist finally began to clear, revealing the first light of dawn, the Hargrove family prepared for the battle ahead. They had been fractured by betrayal, grief, and fear, but now they were united by a single purpose: to break free from the sins of the past and reclaim their future. Part 9. An uncertain future. The morning light crept into the Hargrove household, pale and tentative, as though reluctant to touch a place still thick with shadows of its past. Emily stood at the kitchen sink, staring out at the misty yard, her reflection faint against the glass. The house was quiet for the first time in days, yet the silence was anything but comforting. It felt like the space between breaths, a pause before something yet to come. Margaret shuffled into the kitchen, her movements heavy. She placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly. You didn't sleep, she said softly, though it wasn't a question. Emily shook her head, her eyes never leaving the window. I couldn't. Her voice was hollow. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw James. Margaret's grip tightened. He made his choice, Emily. He saved us, did he? Emily turned to face her aunt, her eyes searching Margaret's face for answers. What if it's not over? What if James wasn't enough? Before Margaret could reply, a faint sound echoed through the house. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, more distinct a knock. Emily's breath caught, her body going rigid. Margaret's face paled as she whispered, "No. It can't be." The knock came again, louder this time. Emily's heart raced as she moved toward the source, her feet carrying her to the front door, as though drawn by an unseen force. Margaret followed, her prayers spilling from her lips in frantic whispers. "Emily, don't," Margaret pleaded, her voice shaking. "Don't open it," but Emily's hand was already on the doorknob. She hesitated, her pulse pounding in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, but something deeper in need for answers, for closure, propelled her forward. She turned the knob and pulled the door open. The morning mist swirled outside, thick and unyielding. The yard was empty, the silence punctuated only by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. Emily stepped onto the porch, her eyes scanning the empty space. "There's nothing here," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Margaret remained in the doorway, clutching her rosary. "It's a warning," she said, her voice trembling. "The curse isn't finished with us." Emily turned back to her aunt, her face set with determination. "Then we have to finish it." The hours that followed were filled with uneasy quiet. Emily buried herself in her father's journal and the letters they had found, searching for any detail they might have missed. Margaret hovered nearby, her rosary clutched tightly in her hands, her lips moving in silent prayer. The house felt alive in a way that set Emily's nerves on edge. Shadows shifted in her periphery, and the air carried a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows felt like a reminder that they were not alone. "Emily," Margaret said suddenly, breaking the silence, "if the curse isn't over, what will you do?" Emily didn't look up from the journal. "I'll do what I have to," she said. "Whatever it takes to end this." Margaret's voice softened. "And if it means sacrificing yourself," Emily's pen stilled on the page. She looked up, meeting her aunt's gaze. "If it means no one else has to suffer, then yes." That night, as the mist thickened once more, Emily sat alone in the study. The journal lay open before her, its pages filled with her father's meticulous handwriting. Her eyes lingered on a single passage: "The curse binds us until the debt is paid in full. Only the truth can set us free." Her father's words echoed in her mind, their meaning as elusive as the shadows that danced on the walls. What truth? What debt? She felt as though she was grasping at smoke, her desperation mounting with every unanswered question. The knock came again. Emily's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was closer. She rose slowly, her heart pounding as she followed the sound. It led her to the hallway, then to the staircase. The knock came again, faint but deliberate, from the door to the attic. Margaret appeared at the base of the stairs, her face etched with fear. "Emily, don't. Whatever's up there, it's not meant to be found." Emily gripped the banister, her knuckles white. "If it's part of the curse, then I need to see it." Margaret shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Please, Emily." Leave it alone, but Emily couldn't. She ascended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. The attic door loomed before her, its surface worn and splintered. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. The knock came again, louder this time, as if urging her forward. She opened the door. The attic was dark, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. Emily's flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating stacks of old furniture, boxes, and a single figure in the corner. Her breath caught as she stepped closer, her flashlight trembling in her grip. It was a mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished. But in its fractured reflection, Emily saw something that made her blood run cold. A shadowy figure stood behind her, its glowing eyes meeting hers through the glass. She spun around, but the space was empty. The figure remained in the mirror, its form flickering like a dying flame. It raised a hand, pointing to something in the corner of the attic. Emily followed its gesture, her steps hesitant. There, beneath a tattered sheet, she found a small wooden chest. She lifted the lid to reveal a bundle of papers, their edges yellowed with age. The papers detailed the original contract her grandfather had signed, along with notes and a script she didn't recognize. At the bottom of the stack was a single sentence, scrawled in bold, uneven handwriting: "The curse will never end until the blood debt is willingly repaid." Emily's grip tightened on the papers. The figure in the mirror flickered once more before vanishing, leaving her alone in the attic. She descended the stairs, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her like a physical force. Margaret met her at the base of the stairs, her face pale. "What did you find?" Emily held up the papers, her expression grim. "The truth. And a way to end this." As the night deepened and the house settled into an uneasy stillness, Emily sat with Margaret in the living room. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and sacrifice. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. They would face the curse head-on, and together, they would fight to break free from its grasp. And yet, as the clock struck midnight, a faint knock echoed through the halls once more, leaving Emily and Margaret to wonder, was it the end, or merely another beginning?